right. We're all good. We're on. Hey, it's such an honor to be here with all of you guys. It's been such a fun weekend for me. I'm going to be kind of taking this more from the approach of reading, of this being a reading than more of a presentation. I've got a lot of notes, and I'm just really looking forward to the time. It's going to be mostly kind of autobiographical, so I hope you kind of can see my heart through it all and give you a little bit of my story, and bet you we can all identify on a lot of the journey that we've had. And I'm just going to start off just in terms of a little bit of what so many of the people here have meant to me. I think it was shortly after the Northridge earthquake, I went through a time where I, for some reason, didn't enjoy flying anymore. I was just afraid to fly. And you know, every time I'd get on the plane, from the moment I would sit down, it was like borderline white knuckler sort of fear, just all the way through. And I would literally think of all of the horror stories that I'd read from the news clippings about the accidents, and then just my imagination would just hear a pitched engine that was a little higher than I thought it should be, and I would just kind of like think that the absolute worst was going to happen. And it was just kind of horrible. And one day, there was a friend of mine that was a flight inspector, and he kind of sat down and patiently kind of went over each of the scenarios that I explained to him from the newspapers, all these kind of nightmare scenarios. And he explained every one of them. Like, he explained about why the roof peeled off of the Honolulu airplane over Oahu, which miraculously nobody died in that one. And then he talked about how the airline regulatory agency, after that, kind of mandated all the airlines to test and replace the rivets on the planes at real specific intervals. And he told me about glide ratios in the event of a failed engine and other basic mechanics generic to just to flying. And the end result after that is it just put my nerves at ease. I was able to fly again. And so many people here have done that for me with just explaining Scripture and who God really is. You know, there was a time where I've been so terrorized by my bad theology in the past. And you know, in the absence of good theology, even if someone wasn't saying something bad, if I didn't get the adequate questions, I would just fill the void with just how a bad theology kind of stemming from what I thought I deserved, which was not much. And it's really kind of odd how, you know, you could be terrorized by the Scripture that has brought me so much beauty and hope. And at the same time, you know, it's just this source of uncertainty and anxiety that's been around in my life. So I'm just incredibly grateful. I'm in a place now where gosh, it's I'm able to enjoy a Father that loves me, and I'm able to express that to my kids and my family and my workers, and it's pretty fun. Anyway, I'm going to kind of get into pretty autobiographical kind of portion of things here. I grew up in Los Angeles by the ocean in a beautiful little community that was started by Methodist Episcopalians who wanted to create a utopian community in about 1911. And I don't know how that worked out. They just moved in and they began to prosper and do well in the area. Before that, it was a Spanish kind of coastal town, just very idyllic and beautiful. You have the mountains to the west and then the ocean just spread out before you. And after that, there was a large wave of German kind of intellectual expats fleeing Nazi Germany that came into the town. So there were a lot of doctors and lawyers and intellectuals, and it was kind of like the place that wasn't much of a faith community at all. And it was kind of interesting to grow up in a place where there really was no faith community. And you know, but I fell in love with the ocean at such an early age. It was kind of pretty much my sanctuary. It was my church experience for me. And I started surfing at an early age, and man, it was like I just got the bug really bad. I was up probably 5 in the morning most mornings, just hiking to the beach, which was about a mile away, just jumping in the water, having fun, watching the sunrise, and just, God, man, I was outside more than I was inside. You know, the only time I was really home was for dinner time, and that was worth it because my mom was a good cook. You know, so I was outside all the time, but you know, when we came inside, it was kind of different. My household had lots of fighting, lots of drama. It just was rarely peaceful. The sounds, I just remember like there being sounds that were so accusatory, it would almost just hurt my brain. And it was just kind of sad to be in that environment. I found a lot of safety. The only sanctuary I had there was my sister's room. I would go into my sister's room, and she was about 5 years older than me, and she just had this amazing record collection. And I would just start turning on all of her records and just lie down and look at the album covers. And man, it was the only place I felt safe in that house. And as time went by, you know, I did what a lot of other people do in those little towns, those little surf communities, started getting in trouble, and which was, you know, for me kind of fun. You know, and it was easy to get in trouble. There wasn't a lot of parental supervision in the whole town. It was almost like the culture was like we all raised ourselves, and we raised each other, and we were latchkey kids. And in a way, I enjoyed the freedom, and I loved the freedom of being outside. But again, there was a lot of pain growing up in that childhood. So I started to do the things that kids do to kind of mask that pain and deal with the pain, which was do a lot of drugs. And I was 13 at the time. Almost fortunately, by the time I was 14, I just kind of bottomed out. You know, I was running away from home for months at a time. And surprisingly, you know, I liked being outside. I was actually having a good time. I was in the ocean, hiking through the hills, you know, just enjoying my freedom. But that really didn't kind of settle what was going on inside. And I completely bottomed out. Somehow my parents ended up getting me stuck in rehab, which is kind of no big deal. I mean, it's like rehab, and where I'm come from is almost like a rite of passage. It's not like it's this, it's just not this big deal. It's not a big, you know. But the place that they stuck me in, you know, because they didn't really know where to put me, was UCLA's Neuropsychiatric Institute, Building A South. And for many in Los Angeles, so I got to have an inside look at the absolute best in child's mental health care in Los Angeles. And I sharpened my ping pong game, like me. Like if you guys, like, and I learned how to blow smoke rings through smoke rings through smoke rings through smoke rings. Thank you so much. And so, you know, it wasn't all that bad. It was a time for me to really detox, too. And I needed that, and also to see who my true friends were. I think the only person that visited me was like the one Christian in all of the Palisades where I grew up, and he visited me, and his name was Gino, and he was a cool guy. He actually was, you know, a great surfer and a great artist, and I just always respected him. And so the fact that he kind of visited me out of the blue when nobody else did meant a whole lot to me, man. It just did. And you know, the docs were all trying to finish their internships, and my doc was a guy named Paul Barkopolitz, and he had a full beard and kind of John Lennon spectacles, and you know, we'd sit down once a week, and you know, he's a nice enough guy, but I could always tell he was kind of emotionally removed. He was thinking about, you know, where he was going to take his date that night, and he was just kind of self-preoccupied. And you know, I understand there's, you know, some of my take-home and understanding of it all is that, you know, there's good research to indicate that psychotherapy or counseling of any sort is helpful, you know, but there's also about the same amount of research that says that one school of psychotherapy isn't really outperforming the other. So it's kind of interesting. I think at the end, I've drawn two conclusions from all of that. And one is that if you're going through hell, it does help to talk to somebody. And I think everybody here knows that, you know, and hopefully someone that's not going to be judging you. I almost feel like it's better to talk to a secular psychologist sometimes than a Christian counselor who's going to give you, you know, the 10 things that you need to do. But the other thing is that, you know, with the reliance of prescription drugs, and I understand sometimes they're helpful, and man, they loaded me up on I was like on elephant, you know, prescription dosages. You know, sometimes it's helpful, sometimes it's flat out necessary, but it also kind of reveals the elephant in the room, which is that nobody understands the human soul. That's what this prescription means. It's like, hey, I don't understand, but this is the best I can do for now, you know? You know, and fortunately, I'm there, you know, in UCLA's South Neuropsychiatric Institute, and you know, there's one person there that I just flat out understood what was going on, and he spoke with such clarity and just amazing kind of persuasion that just penetrated right into me. And he said one thing to me, and he said, everything's going to be okay. You know, and man, it was the first time I'd heard the voice of Jesus. You know, I was in the bathroom at the time, and every cell in my body just responded, just was like, good, like it was just, it's done, it's just done. And so that Friday, you know, I'm having my weekly meeting with Dr. Paul Berkopolitz again, and I'm like, man, look, I'm good, I got the lessons that I needed to get, I'm ready to get checked out of here, you know, trust me, you know, I'm stable. I'm really in a good place right now. And I didn't tell him about my little conversation, you know, the little voice that I heard. You know, I wasn't that stupid, you know. So I left that one out, you know. You know, it's like, you know, and you know, only later I found out that they were planning on transferring me to a more secure, long-term facility, and it was payback for a group meeting that I had the prior week, where they had all the psychs and all the patients kind of gathered, and I just kind of got up and just, you know, said, you guys are all full of shit, you know? And that's not normally who I am, but I'm telling you, man, they brought it out of me because, you know, again, they were nice enough people, but it was like they would just talk and talk and talk and talk. And, you know, even as a kid, and all of us kids, we knew that they weren't speaking any language that was relevant to any sort of true understanding of the human soul. And it was kind of comforting. Like afterwards, I was crying and screaming, and the kids just came up, like lined up, one after the other, and they just like hugged me. And man, some of these kids were like so messed up, man. I was like, whoa, it's amazing just to the sad, you know, state of affairs, of kind of brokenness and what that does to children. And my parents got you know, kind of heard my cry that, hey, I'm better, and they listened to me. And they also got a second opinion from a really reputable source, another person who was a children's psychologist, and they sprung me. So they got me out. They're going to give me another chance at kind of things. And, you know, I got out, man. The first thing I wanted to do was just get back into the ocean, because that was, again, outside of my sister's room, that was the only place I felt embraced, man. It was like that water just washing over you, and it's so powerful. It's so much bigger than you are. It almost was like my higher power. I want to back up, actually, to one story about surfing and the first time that I heard Jesus. I had a friend named Eric Iserling, and he was a surfer. We were in the 5th grade, and we were just starting to surf. And we would meet at the beach, and there was a guy named Joe who lived at the apartment, down there right on the beach across the street from where we surfed. And Joe would let all the kids use his old surfboards. And he kind of stored them underneath a staircase. There was like a little closet, and we'd go in and just take out a bunch of old junker boards and just go have a blast on them. And one day, Eric, who's total agnostic, his dad was a UCLA geography professor. We were talking about Joe. I've never met Joe in my life and never heard about Joe. But Eric's like, yeah, Joe, he's really into Jesus. And man, it was like when I heard that, something just went off inside of me. It was just because before, my association with Jesus was like Rotary Club meetings and just functions and like just kind of like a Charlie Brown school experience. I had never heard it in the context of there being sort of a person that you can have a fellowship with. And it was like actually kind of like a moment for me where I felt like I kind of understood that this Jesus was somebody that I wanted to know about. Okay, 1 second here. Come on, little iPad. So I got out of UCLA, and I started to make new friends. Life really was beginning to play out in a beautiful way. It really was going to be okay. I got back in school. I was doing really well. After hearing that voice, I naturally joined a local church, Presbyterian church, started learning about the nature of God, or at least the way that was communicated to me, and found a lot of joy. I mean, Jesus was there, man. The presence of the Lord would just fill my heart, and so tender, and just began to wash over me, and felt a lot of healing in that. At the time, I fell in love with literature. I was reading C.S. Lewis was a great source of inspiration, and life at home was still pretty much the same. So these sort of voices in my life were so important. I remember reading the biography of Corrie ten Boom and being so impressed by just the authenticity of her story and of the fellowship that he had with Jesus and in the middle of hell. And my sister had moved out of the house, and things just continued to be noisy, and music kind of was the place where it would just kind of bathe my mind and drown out all the bitterness that was in the air. And a friend of mine turned me on to this one musician, a soft-spoken believer named Phil Keggy. And man, I would just listen to his albums and just all day long. And it was like brought so much healing to my life. He was living in Los Angeles at the time, and I would catch him like 4 or 5 times at a concert. And I remember just sitting down with all the other people in the church, and everybody's faces were, kind of like waxen, and everyone was kind of stiff, and no one really looked like they were that happy, And then he'd start to play, and then you'd see like people's expressions, like their countenances would just begin to melt, and there'd just be like this joy that would be on people, and he'd do that for an hour and a half, and I'd just be like, man, it's like, how do I just bottle that? How can I just take that with me and feel that where, so it never goes away. And some of the older believers that I met really took me under their wing, and we'd go surfing, and my parents kind of stayed together despite all the drama. And my dad was a good provider, and my mom was just a wonderful, wonderful cook. So to this day, they're together. They live in separate sides of the house, but they've brokered kind of a sweet relationship and respect for each other. And it's like, for real, my mom cooks well, and it's like, what are you going to move away to? It's like, You know, I'm like so in love with my wife, you know, it's just crazy. But I just tell her straight up, like, look, if anything happens to you, the second time I'm going to marry from just for food. That's it. That's it, you know. You know, and my spiritual life did have a richness to it, a genuine richness, and yet there was an equally unsettling question nobody seemed able to answer, and it was the question for me as a Presbyterian of my election. And I was kept busy. I was trying to finish school. I was going to church and spending a lot of time surfing and playing music and getting an education apart from public school. I had a tutor during that time named Penny Emerson. And I saw her every day for an hour or two. My parents paid for that just to kind of get me caught up. And that first year, the first 2 years, I didn't even go to high school. So one, I was just out, you know, like Tom Sawyer in the hills and the ocean. The second, I was trying to catch up and get ready. So Penny had just come back from a 4-year trip traveling the world. And she traveled to every country, mostly hitchhiking. And she did it from 1976 to 1980, and on a budget of what she said would have been the cost of a new Volvo at the time. And we just studied. I just loved it, man. We studied Shakespeare and geography and Latin word roots and writing and a bit of math. And I literally learned more from Penny in 2 years than I had through my entire public schooling, you know, education, and probably even more than what I'd learned in college. Her dad was an accomplished classical musician, pianist, and they had a grand piano right by their front door, and I remember just going up to the front door and just hearing him pour out into the notes. And man, he could sight read. He was really kind of just one level short of kind of recital level, you know, performer. And man, I just would sit there for like 5 or 10 minutes before I'd knock, because it just felt like so violating, because this man was just pouring himself into these pieces. And he was a brilliant, brilliant man. He'd worked a number of years in a government think tank, and he built his own computers before PCs had their debut. And one day he had an ear infection, and his parents were Christian Scientists, and they refused to have his ear looked at by a doc. And he lost his hearing in one ear, and with that he lost his chance at becoming a recital level pianist. And he used to step on my toes with all of his weight. He just would come up, and it was kind of odd, you know. I wasn't sure. You know? And he had these really bright blue eyes that were framed by these bushy white eyebrows that had these kind of dramatic pointy ends. You know? And he was just like, he'd just stare at me just all intently with this big grin, like a hand's face away, you know? And he was just kind of like waiting to see how I would react, you know? And you know, a year later, he shared some advice with me. He said, before you choose a woman to marry, step on their toes first. And he didn't qualify it beyond that. Just step on their toes first. And you know, I've subsequently translated Mr. Emerson's kind of odd performance art message as, make sure she knows how to forgive you and can accept you for who you are. And I share that with my kids. And the whole family, the Emerson family, supported and encouraged me during that time of major transition and lots of pain. But they also challenged my faith, especially the creationist tracts my youth leaders gave me, who were concerned with my association with the Emerson family, who were kind of hardcore atheists. Of course, the Emersons laughed at the little pamphlets. And man, I love them. I love that family so much. And they were like so peculiar in the best way. They were really stranger than fiction. I mean, I could just go on and on and on. And it was hard. It was really, really hard. Like imagining them all burning in hell forever in eternity for not, accepting Jesus Christ as personal Lord and Savior. Well, things went on. School was finishing. I was grinding it out and having fun and dealing with home life and situation. And it was a senior year, the summer before my senior year, and I got really into C.S. Lewis. And I was sitting on my parents' 60s mauve green tweed wingback chair reading Lewis. And actually I was reading The Pilgrim's Regress, which I'd saved for last in his collection of fiction, which was actually the first book he wrote. And all of a sudden I had this odd feeling, like the blood and my equilibrium were just slowly draining from my body. And man, it was like right in the middle of a full-blown nervous breakdown. And at the center of it was my anxiety and my thinking that I might be one of God's kind of ignoble vessels of pottery born for the purpose of being discarded. And my election was totally unsure. I was lost somewhere in what I perceived as God's cosmic fine print, vaulted till the end of the age. My mom was deeply sympathetic to the situation, and she listened really carefully. She spoke very, very tenderly. She was a civil rights kind of participant, and she started to sing "We Shall Overcome" to me and forced me to sing it with her. I mean, that, and man, she just sung it with gusto and conviction and a little desperation too, Just like, oh my God, what's happening to my son, man? I'm losing him fast. And, I tried to sing along just slightly above a whimper. And my dad was, of course, as a Swedish dad would be, in the other room. I'm sure he was concerned, but he kind of probably figured I'd pull out eventually, And where is this? And it got so bad that they called up the local minister, actually, and he was a head pastor of a large Presbyterian church, to try to kind of talk me out of the tree. And man, I got on the phone with him and just told him what I was going through. And it was weird because I felt like there was almost that same distance between him and me on the phone as there was between my psychologist, Dr. Barkopoulos. And man, I just knew he was just, that was just to use the cliche, man, that was like literally a phoned in kind of conversation. It was just canned. I could have been listening to a recording, and his advice was, son, you got to get right with God and just go by your bed and just kind of kneel down and find peace with God, And it's like, peace with God. It's like, I just read the Billy Graham, book by the name of the same title, Peace with God. What do you think I'm trying to do? I'm trying to find peace with God. And it's like nowadays, you hear stories of like charismatics and stuff, and it's like they're giving out scrolls to people who've been through the dark night of the soul, and they're knighting people, and I get the like, go get peace with God speech. It's like I got so gypped as a Presbyterian, man. Just damn. Man, so this tide was just pulling me under, man, and there was nothing I could do to fight it. And if you've ever been in the ocean in a weird situation, there are times where the best thing you can do is don't try to fight it, man. Don't try to fight it. So, so I found myself agreeing with Job, or something like that. God, you gave me my sanity, and it's yours to take. Maybe it was grace or a healthy sense of self-preservation, having been in the mental health care and not wanting to go back there, that kind of caused me to let go and just go with it and let God work this one out. And I just knew, man, my little Calvinist haunted soul, man, it was in God's hands, man. I had as much hope fighting that little thing that I was in and, a 20-foot wave crashing on me and nothing you can do. And at that moment, man, I just felt that sense of stasis slowly but steadily returning back to me over the next 12 hours. I just kind of came back to my right mind. And ever since then, I've always kind of had this kindred kind of thing with Nebuchadnezzar, man. I've just always felt like, yeah, dude, I'm that guy, man. I just have solidarity with that dude. And life went on. And, even if you are in the middle of low-grade depression or acute depression, it's like, there's like cinnamon toast with lots of butter. And that helped, man. That helped. And I had my ocean view from my window that just was like a constant source just of settling my nerves, just watching that Pacific. We were about a mile away up in the hills a bit. And, amidst my bad theology, I continued to experience this stunning beauty of God's presence in my life. And later that year, I discovered two Southern Catholic novelists, Walker Percy from Louisiana and Flannery O'Connor. Walker Percy wrote tenderly about perplexed souls like me. I read everything he wrote and found a lot of comfort there. Flannery enjoyed writing short stories about people who were confident they could navigate the vagrancies of life through human enlightenment or religious dogma, only to find themselves in circumstances where both frameworks came violently crashing down on them. And in their writings, I began to sense a greater safety just being in mystery, and then in trying to have all my answers, or all my questions answered. And man, those voices of exclusion still yapped in my ear, but they're beginning to be challenged by other voices that sounded a lot more like grace. I also read my favorite George MacDonald book, Lilith, during this time, and MacDonald seemed to suggest a work of divine reconciliation that was much larger in scope than anything I'd entertained. MacDonald stirred a hope inside of me, but it was dangerous to hold that too close. That would just be wrecked if I went to my local pastor. What do you think about this? Slam. So I just kind of like kept that inside. I just took like a little vial of George MacDonald's hope, just to travel around. The guy was so crazy, he believed like animals were included, like how are you going to like... I just couldn't bank it all on MacDonald, the dude's got his, Baxter's favorite book called Unspoken Sermons. Well, why do you think it's called Unspoken Sermons? So, man, I tucked that one into my back pocket and I just hoped, man, to God that this dude who thought even animals were going to get to heaven might be right. Because, man, I was still just like... and I began to have... I began to actually just feel like a human being. I got out of school, and I traveled to the Virgin Islands for a year just to kind of decompress and write poetry and make chocolate chip cookies with coconuts I'd kind of like whacked out of trees, and just walked a lot and got in the water a lot. And it was a fun year. Met a lot of neat people, beautiful down there. And then it was time for me to return, and so I was coming back to go to college. And with college, that kind of also came with trying to figure things out again, being analytical and going back to, seeing if maybe I was included, and trying to kind of navigate that one. And there were no more panic attacks, and thank God. The acute depression left and never came back in my life. I'm very grateful for that. And but at the same time, there was just that question inside of me, and I got locked into, just to kind of run through a few things. I got locked into a 5-year relationship and just wasn't really going anywhere. didn't know what I was going to do with my life. I thought maybe I'd teach literature, and I loved cooking from a young age, but nobody celebrated the culinary arts when I was growing up. I mean, the only two stations that you could watch were two people, was Julia Childs and the Galloping Gourmet on PBS, and even then, we'd only watch them as if we were sick, if we didn't go to school that day, But man, I thrived when I was in the kitchen. I'd be outside. My parents had a big backyard, and my dad would want me to be out there, helping with lumber and clearing grass, and I'd just be like, well, what do I have to do, But he was just like, just get out of here, man. Your attitude sucks. But I'd be in the kitchen. It would just be like, okay, what next? What next? You want me to peel the peas? You wash some dishes? Sure, man, no problem, And so I just kind of loved being in the kitchen. But again, that was not a real option in my town or even at the time. It wasn't something that was celebrated and encouraged. Hey, pursue culinary arts. And there was a guy about that time who I met at a Christian bookstore. And man, my spiritual life was just feeling so dry. It was like, yeah, I wasn't neurotic like I used to be and having a nervous breakdown over these questions. But man, I had just come to that grinding, dry place of exhaustion. And a friend said, hey, there's this Vineyard Church, it's really alive and the Spirit is showing up, and that was the big thing. It's like if somebody said the Spirit is showing up, in Los Angeles, people just don't have this vocabulary. When you've grown up with that, it's no big deal, right? You just kind of get jaded to, somebody says some sort of thing like that. But for me, it was when he said, man, the Spirit is showing up. I want to go to this meeting, man. And I went, and it was a Vineyard Church. It was kind of affiliate of, offshoot of John Wimber's Anaheim Vineyard. And man, there were these beautiful, warm-hearted people there, and they were interesting people. They were creative people, just all different backgrounds of life. And it was a wonderful time. It was just maybe you guys, hopefully everyone's had an experience at a kind of a church experience where you've just met friends that you've kind of maintained for life. And man, we met spouses and started businesses, and it was just a dynamic time, and everything was relatively, healthy and a good experience. But I got married, and we moved away to a different place. My wife went to Fuller Seminary for a couple years, and we just started having kids. And our first kid was born. She was so high maintenance, we would take her to church, and the nursery just wouldn't have it. So she was just like a little bucking bronco. I don't know if you've ever experienced a super high maintenance kid, but she was that kid. And what do I have, 15 more minutes? 10 minutes? I don't want to go over my time. Am I okay? 10? Okay. Appreciate that. And so we kind of just, they'd call us out at church every time. So after a while, it was what's the point in driving 45 minutes to church? We're just going to get called out. And so we just kind of disconnected from church, We just would take long walks. We were just newly married. We both had come from crazy situations, and it was just such a healing time, man. We'd take walks at 2 in the morning and throughout Pasadena. And, we'd go to some conferences now and then, and those were kind of encouraging. There could be some cool people, especially in the beginning, I think 20 years ago. I remember the product table, after some of these big conferences. It would be like that, there'd just be one table. And I remember the one book, I never read it, but I think it was called The Three Battlegrounds by this guy Francis Frangipane, and just had this cool green mystical kind of cover on it. I'm like, that's cool. I never read it. And then there was and there wasn't much more. There was just a few things. And then, and then I noticed over the year, man, it was within 5 years, man, that one little table with the Delirious albums and the Kevin Prosh had grown into a whole room of the 15 ways of, getting closer with God and finding your breakthrough for this and that. And it was just You know, and the bad thing about me, man, and this is like my little bit of elitism, is, man, I've got a thing. I don't like ghost-written books. Man, if you can't write your own book, why are you publishing? You know, there's a few exceptions. I'll grant that. But it's like, man, you guys, it's like, you know what a labor of love it is, what an endeavor, man, to put your thoughts out and to commit towards putting them in a form that's going to represent you. And it's like, man, it's like these, it almost was like the people that were publishing the books didn't even have enough of their heart vested to want to write them, you know? And so here are these books, like more and more and more and more and more and more, just stuff about less and less and less and less and less. And man, it seemed like Jesus just like was just doing the magical disappearing act, you know, in the middle of the revivals conferences. And it just was like, man, it was like I could barely even handle any of that. And then, you know, one day, my wife's like, there's a conference up in Santa Cruz, and we're going to go to it with a bunch of the moms. And they did. And, you know, it was like the Crowders and the Duns and the Winnie Banoff. And, man, it was just like, wow, man, they just came back so wrecked, so wrecked. And, you know, and she brought that back, and, man, it was like, that was kind of my, you know, there's always been the dots of grace in my life, you know, and my little George MacDonald Hope vial that I, you know, always kept, you know, thank God for that. But like this was like the point, man. It was like the tipping point, you know what I mean? It was like the religious thing was just going to get the smack down and wasn't going to come back up. And, you know, and what was I going to say here? I'm going to shift over some of this stuff. I mean, you guys know that message, so I think I'm just going to pass by some of that stuff, man. But I think the biggest thing was, you know, in a nutshell for me, was the onus of my faith and the shift to the faith of God. You know? Because, man, it's like, you know, like when you give a kid, like, too much responsibility or something, too many demands, it's just not fair. It messes them up. It's like there's too much that's in their hands. And it's like, man, it's like with all the onus on my faith, it was kind of gnarly, but to suddenly kind of change focus and just take a breath and just see the initiative of Father, Son, and Spirit. And man, it was like there was just no turning back from there. I'm going to jump to a little thing that my friend and I once a month do for fun. And that's a friend of mine named Brad, and we go surfing at a location north of Santa Barbara called the Hollister Ranch, and it's a beautiful place. I wake up at about 4:30, get the pot of coffee going, drive about 2 hours. Brad and I meet. He has an 11-foot inflatable little Zodiac boat. We load it up with our gear. We wheel it down to the shore, and you have to time your entrance into the ocean just perfectly. Otherwise, man, your whole day is going to get wiped out. Your motor, everything's going to get wiped out. We kind of launch out, get some oars, paddle behind the breakers, start the motor, and then we motor out 8 miles, you know, in all kinds of crazy seas. Sometimes it's a little freaky. And we have to go a mile out to avoid the kelp beds. And, you know, you're trying not to think about all the men in the gray suits that are just kind of swimming around below. And do you guys know about the men in the gray suits? That's just what we call the big white sharks down there, you know. And they're there. It's their environment. And we get to our spot, and we figure out where to anchor, and you have to keep in mind the tides and the swell, so you anchor just right. You put on a really cold wetsuit. You jump in the water that's even colder. You paddle out, you get hammered on the head. It's just kind of, the beatings are rather obligatory. Your head starts to throb with pain if it's wintertime, and surfers affectionately refer to that condition as an ice cream cone headache. And then all that to catch a dozen or so rides, and maybe the longest ride you'll catch is 30 seconds. And then you know, after the end of the day, you pull up anchor, you head back. Usually the wind's picked up and it's a lot more choppy, it's a lot rougher, and you're just bouncing along the ocean. And you know, if you catch a few good waves, man, you're just smiling and thinking about the trip for months, and you can't wait to be back the next month. And you know, it's hard to fathom sometimes what Father, Son, and Spirit are willing to do for us. And I think that they just have it really bad for humanity. Almost like they'd rather die than live without us. I was thinking about some lyrics that might describe their passion and the lengths that they'd go so that no one would be left behind. And if you're not familiar with the song to these lyrics, it was written by a band called The Who in 1971, called Bargain. And it reads, I'd gladly give up. Where is it? I'd gladly give up all I had. I'd gladly lose me to find you. Gladly give up all I had. To find you, I'd suffer anything and be glad. I'd pay any price just to get you. Work all my life, and I will. To win you, I'd stand naked, stoned, and stabbed. I'd call that a bargain, the best I ever had. I'd pay any price just to get you. Work all my life, and I will. To win you, I'd stand naked, stoned, and stabbed. I'd call that a bargain, the best I'd ever had. I'd like to end with a song that I wrote about 3 years ago that kind of, I think, does a good job in just describing the freedom of what I've come to know about the Father's love. And I think it's funny, after I started, so many things changed after hearing this message, but one of these things is I just started to explore a lot of things that I'd always wanted to do but was too scared to do, like putting songs onto a record. And so this song was one of those songs that came out of this time. And do you mind playing that, Caleb? Same song. Yeah, it's and that's how I'm going to end it. And thank you guys. I appreciate it.